Welcome to part 2 of SBR March 2020 paper. So this is part 2, right? In this video I'm going to discuss question 2. So let's go. Before I read the case study, I'll be reading the requirements so that when I read the case study I know what I'm exactly looking for. So let's go down to the requirements, right? This is for 20 marks and your ethics question, right, which usually comes for 5 marks, will be mostly under this section, right? It comes in question 2. At least one question on ethics you will be getting, so you cannot skip that chapter, right? Ethics. So now let's go through this. Part A, the first part is saying discuss the appropriate accounting treatment of the restructuring cost in the financial statements of Backshot Company for the year ended 31st December 2005. So they are talking about restructuring cost here. The main idea, the theme here is restructuring cost, right? Which is for 6 marks. So make sure that you go through restructuring cost, right? Because this is mostly overlooked by many candidates. And now the second part is discuss what is meant by a good stewardship of a company and whether the restructure and the recognition of a restructuring provision in the financial statements are examples of good stewardship. So first you have to discuss what is a good stewardship, right? Second, you have to discuss whether the restructure and the recognition of a restructure provision in the financial statements are examples of good stewardship. So you have to talk about the restructure and the recognition of restructuring provision. Are these examples of what? Good stewardship, which is worth for 4 marks, right? And then finally we reach to the third part of A, which is discuss briefly whether Mrs. Shaw's accusation of the equity shares in Backshot Company should be disclosed as a related party transaction. So a related party transaction is another thing that which appears in your SBR exam most of the time and is for 3 marks, right? And B is your ethics question. Identify and discuss the ethical issues, right, arising from the scenario which Mr. Shaw needs to consider and what actions he should take as a consequence. So here they are asking, first you have to identify, then you have to discuss the points which you have identified as ethical issues. But just identifying and discussing is not enough. You also have to take actions. What you all have to give recommendations, right? What actions has to be taken as a consequence. So first is identify, discuss, and actions, right? This is ethical issues. And your professional marks comes here for part B, right? Now let's go through this. So now when we go through the question, we know what we are looking for, right? Which part is talking about restructuring costs, which part is talking about stewardship and all, right? So we can see that there is just 2 paragraphs here. One is the background, which we anyway have to read. Then we come to the group restructure. Then we come to Mrs. Shaw, right? But if you see part A, the first part and the second part, they talk about the restructuring and the good stewardship. So for that, we don't need this paragraph. We don't need Mrs. Shaw, right? We only need Mrs. Shaw's part for the third part, where they're talking about related party transaction. So we're just going to read the background and the group restructure, right? First, you have to decide what are the things you have to read. So now let's go through this. Sorry, this is something is happening here. Yes. Right here. So Backshot Company as a controlling interest in a number of entities. Group results has been disappointing in recent years and the directors of Backshot have been discussing various strategies to improve group performance the current financial year. The personnel followings are here, right? Mr. Shaw, he's the head accountant. Mrs. Dawes is the chief executive. Mike Starr is the nephew of Mr. Shaw and Mrs. Shaw is the wife of Mr. Shaw. The main thing you have to take care is this one and this one, because they are the relative of the head accountant, Mr. Shaw, right? Whenever you have a relative or a family in the business, you have to Two questions will arise out of this. One is related party transaction question will come. We already saw that there's a question of related party transaction, and another question which will arise is ethics. So when you have a family person in a board, right, in a company, these two questions will arise no matter what. Related party transaction and ethics. Now let's go to the group restructure, right? So Mr. Shaw, an ACCA member. Who's Mr. Shaw? He's an ACCA member. You need these terms first, because when you're writing about ethics, you need to mention that he's an ACCA member and therefore this, right? So Mr. Shaw is an ACCA member, is the head accountant of Backshot Company. He's not a member of the board of directors. Not a member, right? Mrs. Dawes, right, is the chief executive of Backshot Company, is also an ACCA member. Okay, so during December 2005, Mrs. Dawes revealed plans to Mr. Shaw for potential restructure of the Backshot Group, which has been discussed at board meetings, and the restructuring plans included a general analysis of expected cost, which would be incurred should the restructure take place. This include legal fees, reallocation cost for staff, and also redundancy cost for a number of employees. One such employee to be made redundant is Mike Stiles, the nephew of Mr. Shaw. So this is one ethical this thing, right? Redundant is this one, the nephew of this one. This is one ethics, right? Mrs. Doves is insistent that Mr. Shaw should include a restructuring provision for all of the expenditure in the financial statements of Backshot for the year ended 31st December 2005. So he's insistent, right, that they should include restructuring provision for all of the expenditure. This is kind of like imitation thread, right? Mrs. Dawes argues that even if the restructure did not take place exactly as detailed, right? Where were we? Okay, if the restructure did not take place exactly as detailed, similar levels of expenditure are likely to be incurred on alternative strategies. It would therefore be prudent to include a restructuring provision for all expenditure. None of the staff other than Mr. Shaw have been notified of the plans. Make sure that none of the staff have been notified of the plans. Although Mrs. Davis has informed Mr. Shaw that she expects a final decision and public announcement to be made prior to the authorization of the financial statements. Right? So based on this, we can answer the first two parts. Discuss the appropriate accounting treatment of restructuring costs in the financial statements. Now we have to take about what are the restructuring costs. We need to talk about the legal fees, right? The legal fees, the reallocation cost for staff, the redundancy cost, all this cost, right? Now let's see how the answer has been presented for the first part, right? So whenever you have to start writing an answer for SBR, where you know clearly that this is the IFRS, right, or IAS, right? This is the standard which has to be applied. You have to mention a little about that standard. For example, in this one, how they started. They directly didn't go to the case study, started explaining this. First, they explained what are the criteria for recognition. You always need to mention, first you have to mention the criteria for recognition. These are the criteria. Right? Criteria for recognition. This is recognition. So first you always have to mention, not so much in detail, but the criteria for the recognition. Then you have to say whether the things in your case study, right, the items in your case study, could they be recognized based on the criteria, right? If they satisfy the criteria, yes, they can be recognized, otherwise they cannot. That's how you have to come up with an answer. Immediately don't go and start writing the answer. First you have to say, okay, under these are the criterias. Now you see how the answer has been presented. Okay, I'm going to read the answer. A provision for restructuring cost should only be recognized, only, right? A provision for a restructuring cost should only be recognized in the financial statements of, see, they didn't write it general terms. They told a provision for restructuring cost should only be recognized in the financial statements of this company. Please mention the company, right? The company in the case study. It's essential that you do that. Without that, you are going to lose marks. You're going to throw away marks. And these are very easy marks. Trust me. So a provision for restructuring cost should already be recognized in the financial statements of backshot company where all of the following criteria are met. Not just one. All the three criteria need to be met. Now you will list one by one after the other. Right? What are the criteria? So first criteria. So what I wanted to say is, what I'm trying to say is, to write the criteria, you need to be thorough with the IAS 37, right? So whenever you study, go through your IAS or FRS. Please, the main thing is the measurement, right? Based on the standard, how something is going to be measured or how something is going to be recognized. These two things you need to know under all the IAS you study, under all the IFRS you study, right? So that recognition and measurement part is very, very important, right? You don't need to know pages and pages and details of that IAS or IFRS, but you at least need to know how something is recognized based on that standard. Because if you don't know, then you cannot use your judgment. You cannot say that whether this can be recognized or not if you are not sure with the criteria. So you need to be very thorough with it. Make sure that you memorize it, you know it, right? Just don't memorize without understanding. You understand the concept first and then you memorize it, right? So these are the three criteria. A reliable estimate can be made of the amount of the obligation. Okay, so it is not just you are saying that there is some obligation in the future. You have to have a reliable estimate, some figure which is reliable needs to be put on that. It's not accurate, it's okay, but still an estimate has to be made. Second criteria, it is probable that an outflow of resources embodying economic benefits will be required to settle the obligation. Yes, money will be going out, right? Outflow of resources. Something in the future will need to be going out of your business to settle the obligation. And the third is there is a present obligation as a result of a past event. Something must have happened in the past for there to be a present obligation. If there nothing happened in the past, you cannot say there is a provision for restructuring cost, right? Now, now let's go. So IS 37 provision contingent liabilities and contingent assets. States, states, see the word they are using, right? Whenever you go through the mark scheme, right? After you do a question or you read the answers, please don't just read everything, you know, just don't try to read everything and memorize it. Because if you try to memorize an answer and write it in the exam, right? You will not remember. 99% of the time you will not remember. You will not remember, trust me, you will forget. So don't try to memorize each and every answer. What you have to memorize is what are the measurements, what are the recognition criteria under the IFRS and IAS. That's all you have to memorize, not the answers. Answers will vary, right? Answers will keep varying. What you have to know is what are the keywords, how they are presenting the answer. You just have to know the way of writing an answer. The points and all you can write it. So don't try to memorize word by word. You don't have to be exactly the same the way the answer is presented to you, because the answer is longer than the standard answer which is expected of you under the exam condition. It is just for you to study, for your study purpose, for your revision purpose. So I would like to advise that please don't memorize word by word. It will not help you. Okay, now let's get back. to where I stopped. Okay, states. So this type of words needs to be there. States. Okay, IAS 37 states, right? Even if you don't mention the name, right, for the students, if you don't want to write provision, contingent liabilities, and contingent assets, still okay, it's fine. You're not forced to write it. You can just say IAS 37 states. That's enough. It is understood, right? What is IAS 37? So IAS 37 states that it would be extremely rare, right? And by the way, one more advice is, please don't use the numbers IS 37 or IFRS, whatever number it is, if in case you forget the number. Because if you put some other number, then it becomes some other standard. You are understanding what I'm getting? It becomes a different standard. Then your whole answer will be wrong, even if it's technically correct. But because it is written using different number, it falls under different standard, your answer will be wrong. So if you have a very sharp memory of remembering the numbers, what standard it is, then only use numbers. Otherwise, avoid using numbers, right? Don't use numbers. So IS 37 provision contingent liabilities and contingent assets states that it will be extremely rare that no reliable estimates can be made, right? A best estimate of the expenditure required to settle the present obligation should be provided as a 31st December should all criteria be met. In the case of a restructuring provision, this should only include direct expenditure arising from the restructuring and not associated with ongoing activities. Mark this, right? I'm not okay. Let me write this. So, only include direct expenditure. So, when it comes to restructuring provision, right? Restructuring provision is under, it comes under provision, right? Under provision, there could be so many types of provision. So, restructuring provision is one kind of provision. So, restructuring provision, they are saying they only include direct expenditure which is related to expenditure restructuring, not ongoing activities. This sentence needs to be there in your answer. Why? Why it needs to be there in your answer? Because the in the in the case study you have been given three types of expenses: the relocation cost, the redundancy cost, the redundant cost, right? And one more cost was there. Let's go back and check. Yes, this were the three costs: legal fees, relocation cost for staff, redundancy cost for number of employees. So there are these three types of cost are there. What are they? Are they ongoing or are they direct expenditure arising from restructuring? You need to classify each one. Then only you can say that it will be a provision should be recognized or not. So this sentence needs to be there. Hence, the real relocation cost would not be included, as although they relate directly to restructuring, the cost would be classified as an ongoing activity. So reallocation not to be included, ongoing activity. Why relocation cost is not included? Now you can say because it is ongoing activity. But before you say that relocation cost will not be included because it's ongoing activity, you need to mention this. Let me put in star here. This sentence needs to be there. This sentence comes from my IS 37, right? All these sentences are picked from your textbook only, directly from your textbook as it is, right? Now let's go to the second paragraph. Can you see there's a division in the paragraph, different paragraphs? Please always, I always mention this in all my videos, put your answers into different paragraphs. Don't put more than 5 sentences under one paragraph. Your paragraph should not be too long. Too many lines, too many sentences should not be there in one paragraph. Rather, rather than writing 10 lines under one paragraph, put it under two different paragraphs and write five lines. Right? Now let's go to the second paragraph. An obligation is regarded as probable when the event is more likely than not to occur. Right? It is not clear that the restructuring is probable. It is not clear that restructuring is probable. Not clear that restructuring is probable, right? Because they didn't tell about the probability of the restructuring, by the way. It's not clear. So you, whenever something is not clear, whenever some evidence is not given to you in the case study, you are always free to write it. Don't think that if it's not there, then you try to make something. You somehow try to fit it into that it is probable or it could be recognized. No, you are free to say that it's not clear that restructuring is probable. Why? Because it's not there. From the case study, you cannot find any information where it says that is probable. So whenever such information is not there, you are free to write this sentence in any situation that this is not clear, right? So now let's go to Mrs. Davis has indicated that alternative strategies are possible and further clarification would be required to ascertain whether these activities will constitute a restructuring as per IS 37. Yes, you need to talk about alternative strategies here because in the case study they have told about alternative strategies. Okay, only then it may be determined that a restructuring is indeed probable. So now let's go. Okay, a constructive obligation for restructuring, right? All these words, all this constructive obligation, then obligation, all these things you should be knowing. Okay. Okay. So a constructive obligation for restructuring only arises where a detailed formal plan exists and a valid expectation to those affected by the restructuring that it will take place as occurs. So these two things are very important for constructive obligation. You need to mention about constructive obligation whenever restructuring is there. Whenever restructuring comes, constructive obligation has to be there, right? So two things are there. One is a detailed formal plan exists. Second thing is valid expectation affected by the restructuring. It could be your employees or anyone, right, who is going to be affected by this restructuring. So these two things, one is detailed formal plan has to be existed. The other one is valid expectation from the affected people by this restructuring. These two things exist, then there's a constructive obligation for restructuring. If these two things are, if one of these things is not there, it's not a constructive obligation, right? Constructive obligation for restructuring does not exist that time. Okay, so a plan is in place, right? Because even in the case study you must have seen that they told that there's a plan in the place, but management does not yet appear committed as alternative strategies are possible. Yes, managements are not so committed. Why? Because they know that there's an alternative strategies which are possible. It is unlikely, therefore, that the plan is detailed. See, just see how they are linked, right? First, they used an evidence from the case study. This is this line. Our plan is in place, but management does not appear committed. How they know management is not ever committed? They do from the case study. Second, only they told. Based on that line, they are saying it is unlikely, therefore, that the plan is detailed and specific enough for this criteria to be satisfied, right? For example, the specific expenditure to be incurred, the date of its implementation, and time frame, which should not be unreasonably long, must be identified, right? So the expenditure, specific expenditure for the restructuring needs to be identified. The date of the implementation needs to be identified and the time frame also, right? That they should not be, it should not be too long. So with alternative strategies available, this does not appear to be the case. Because there are alternative strategies, right? They are saying that they are not being able to identify the specific expenditure, the date of the implementation. Furthermore, Mr. Shaw is the only member of the staff who has been notified. If you have seen that Mrs. Dove have already informed Mr. Shaw of the restructuring plan, not anyone else. So Mr. Shaw is the only member of the staff who has been notified and no public announcement has been made as at the reporting date. So no public announcement has been made. Only member of staff who has been notified. Consequently, there is no obligation in existence as of 31st December 2005 and no provision can be recognized. Now just see. This line is very, very important. This is your conclusion and you will be getting 1 mark for this whole thing. Based on everything you said, this is your conclusion. Yes, say. Right? No obligation in existence. First, you have to prove that there's an obligation. Now, because the obligation does not exist, as at 31st December 2005, you have to mention about the date, by the way, right? And no, whenever provision comes into the place, mentioning of date anyway, in any case, right? In SBR, mentioning of date is very important. Don't forget your dates. Date needs to be mentioned, right? So no obligation in existence as of 31st December 2005 and no provision can be recognized. If no obligation means no provision. Now let's go and see what is in the last paragraph. They're talking about Mrs. Davis has identified that a final decision on the restructuring and communication is likely to take place before the financial statements are authorized. Right? Make sure what he has identified. Right? This paragraph is also very important. Right? When you read it later, you will understand why. Because you might be thinking that now it's over, why this last paragraph is there, right? Because they have clearly told no provision. Still, there's a statement by Mrs. Dow. So Mr. Dowes has identified that a finalization of the restructuring communication is likely to take place before the financial statements are authorized. This, what does it mean? Before the financial statements are authorized, what is coming into your mind? It is something, an event which is arising after the reporting date, right? So this would almost certainly be a material event arising after the reporting date. Material event arising after the reporting date. But should be treated as non-adjusting. You need to say that it should be treated as what? Remember, there are two things. One is adjusting, one is non-adjusting. This is non-adjusting. Accordingly, backshot company should disclose the nature of, okay, since it's non-adjusting, right? So backshot company should disclose the nature of restructuring. Okay, they should disclose the nature of restructuring and an estimate of its financial effect. When something is not adjusted, you have to mention about the nature of it and the estimate of its financial effect. But recognition of a restructuring provision is still prohibited. Just see. This needs to be there. These are the keywords. I've highlighted the keywords in your answers. Without this, you cannot expect to get the full maximum marks. You need to get these points. Recognition of restructuring provision is still prohibited. When something is non-adjusting, you have to know what are the things you need to do. When something is adjusting, you should know what you have to do. Now let's go to the second one, right? Second is for 4 marks. So now let's see. Again, I will read the requirements again. They're talking about discuss what is meant by good stewardship and whether the restructure and the recognition of restructuring provision in the financial statements are examples of good stewardship, right? So you need to know about the stewardship something to write, right? Now let's see what they have written. Stewardship is an ethical principle which embodies the responsible planning and management of resources. Okay, the directors of backshot company perform a stewardship role in that they are appointed by the shareholders to manage on their behalf. The directors therefore assumes responsibilities to protect the entity's resources from unfavorable effects of economic factors such as price and technological changes and to ensure that backshot company complies with all laws, regulations, contractual obligations. Group results has been disappointing. Okay, now the point comes here. Where is the statement taken from? If anyone can remember, group results has been disappointing. Go to your background information and just say this. Group results have been disappointing for several years. Right? All kind of information, whether even as in the introduction, background, every piece of information you need to use. It's important. You don't know where it, right? It might be useful. Group research has been disappointing in recent years, therefore no specific causes has been identified. It could be argued therefore that the restructuring is acting in a good faith and reflecting good principles of stewardship. It is anticipated that the long-term shareholder value will be enhanced from the proposal. Right? So this is they are talking about the first one. First, you need to talk about 2 points. Discuss the 2 points, you will get the 4 marks. Right? A second factor of good stewardship is that it is important that investors, both existing and potential, and lenders have reliable and accurate information from the entity's resources so that they can assess how efficiently and effectively the entity's management and the governing board have discharged their responsibilities. It is important therefore that the financial statements are transparent, objective, comply fully with IFRS. Mrs. Dawes wants Backshot to include a restructuring provision as of 31st December 2005, even though no obligation arises. Now I will highlight this. Even though no obligation arises, still she is insisting back, right, that Backshot company should include a restructuring provision. Okay, well, prudence is a guiding principle when dealing with issues of uncertainty. Excessive prudence cannot be justified. Excessive prudence. You cannot say all the expenditures restructuring provision. That is excessive prudence, right? As a qualified member of ACCA, I told you, you need, right, whenever you are a qualified member or something, you need to highlight. You need to use this in your answer. As a qualified member, both are qualified, Mrs. Dowers and Mr. Shao, right? So as a qualified member of ACCA, it should be apparent to Mrs. Dowers that no provision, right? Because she is a qualified member of ACCA, she should know that there are no provision should be recognized, and to include one would be misleading to the stakeholders of Backshot company. So if you include the provision, restructuring provision is included in the financial statements. This is not a good stewardship. Why? It would be misleading to the stakeholders of Backshot company. Now let's go to the third one. Third is for 3 marks, right? So you need to talk. Okay. Discuss briefly whether Mrs. Shaw's acquisition of the equity shares in Backshot would be disclosed as related party transaction. For that, we have to read about Mrs. Shaw, right? This paragraph only. Only this paragraph in it. Mrs. Shaw is the wife of Mr. Shaw, the head accountant of Backshot company, right? This information is given in the introduction, in the background, in the very beginning, right? So they're just repeating it. She is not an employee of Backshot company and does not know about the proposed restructure. Okay, so she is not an employee, does not know about the restructure. However, Mrs. Shaw recently acquired 5% of the equity shares in Backshot company. Acquired how many? 5% equity shares. Mr. Shaw is considering informing his wife of the proposed restructure. Right? Mr. Shaw is considering that she should inform his wife of the proposed restructure so that she can make an informed decision as to whether to divest her shareholding or not. This is not for this perspective, but this could be used in your ethics. Right? Mr. Shaw is concerned that in the short term at least, the inclusion of any restructuring costs would be harmful to the profitability of Backshot company. It is also uncertain as to how the market may react should the restructure take place. It is, however, anticipated that in the long term shareholder value would be enhanced. So now we need to talk about the why from the, the related party transaction or not, right? As for 3 marks, so the answer is also not so big. So now let's see. Okay, Mrs. Shaw's acquisition of the equity shares in Backshot company would be deemed a related party transaction if, just see the word deemed. They are not saying it is a related party. They are saying it would be deemed a related party transaction. Under what? Under what condition? If. So this if word, right? If the accusation enabled her to control or have significant influence. Controlled significant influence over Backshot. A 5% ownership, how much she acquired? Only 5%. 5% ownership would not give Mr. Shaw the control over the operating decisions of Backshot company, and it is clear that she will not be able to control the entity. 5% ownership, you need to talk about that 5% ownership would not give Mr. Shaw the control. It is very clear that she is not controlling. Significant influence is the power to participate in the financial and the operating decisions of the entity. You need to say what is a significant influence. Mention it, right? So it is presumed that a holding of less than 20% of the voting power, right? Presume holding of less than 20% of the voting power is insufficient for a significant influence unless this can be clearly demonstrated. Mrs. Shaw is unaware. She is unaware of the proposed restructure, which should suggest that she does not have a board position. It can be concluded that she does not have a control nor significant influence, right? It can be concluded. Your conclusion matters a lot. Now let's go to the second paragraph. Mrs. Shaw would be deemed to be a close family member of Mr. Shaw. She would therefore be deemed to be a related party if it was concluded that Mr. Shaw is a member of the key management personnel of Bankshot Company. Right? See, she would therefore be deemed to be related party. Only if it was concluded that Mr. Shaw, if he's a member of key management personnel of Bankshot Company, right? Then they could say there's a related party. But just read carefully. Mr. Shaw, is he the key management personnel? Is he the key management personnel of Backshot Company? Without looking the answer, you should be able to tell this. Who is he? He is only a head accountant, right? Is head accountant a key management personnel? You should know this without looking the answer. So, now let's see. Mr. Shaw is the head accountant of Backshot Company, but it seems highly unlikely that he would be deemed to be a key management personnel, right? This is not likely to be a key management personnel. There is no evidence, right? You need to mention this, right? There is no evidence. This words you can write. You are free to write these words. If something is not given to you in the case study, if it's not clear through the case study, you can say there is no evidence that he has the authority or the responsibility for planning, directing, controlling activities of Backshot Company, nor does he appear to be a director of the entity. It can be concluded that Mrs. Shaw's accusation of 5% of the equity in Backshot Company would not be a related party transaction. So finally, your conclusion is it's not a related party transaction, right? Right? So even in the first one, it's not a provision. Restructuring, it cannot be recognized as a restructuring provision. Now, it is not a related party transaction. What happens is most of the time when something is given to you, right? How it is recognized. This this question, how it is recognized, we are always keen, right? We become so interested. We always think that yes, it has to be recognized because the question is how it will be recognized. So don't fall into that trap because you there are chances that something might not be recognized, something might not be as it is. So you can write it like in this case, both the parts you can write. The first part they told is not recognized as restructuring provision. Here they are saying it is not a related party just because they told related party transaction or they're just husband wife, just looking at the fact that they're husband wife in the same company acquiring 5% does not mean that a related party transaction, it's a related party transaction. You need to look at other factors, right? So you always free to say something, no, it is not recognized, no, this is not a related party transaction, no. So you are always free to say no. Don't always assume that you should say yes, 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 it should be recognized, it should be recognized like this, like this, like this. When something cannot be recognized, just say it cannot be recognized. Don't try to make it recognized. Now let's go to the ethics question. Ethics question, right? Just go through all the ethics question from all the past papers and see the nature of it. How an ethics question is written. You will get an idea. You will get a glimpse of it. So identify and discuss the ethical issues arising from the scenario which Mr. Shaw needs to consider and what actions he should take as a consequence, right? So now let's see what it is given. Okay, Mr. Shaw is facing a number of ethical dilemmas arising from the scenario. So it's very clear that Mr. Shaw is facing a number of ethical dilemmas arising from the scenario. Mrs. Dow's insists. So how many ethical issues you can come up with? Before I go to the final the big answer, just tell me 3 points. Okay, I will write it down somewhere so that you know what are the okay. There are three things so far I have come through. One is the husband and wife, right? Mr. Shaw and Mrs. That is one thing. The other one is the nephew. Nephew and Mr. Shaw. And the first one is about the Mrs. Davis, right? And Mr. Shaw. So these are the three things: Mrs. Davis, Mr. Shaw, and Mrs. Shaw, nephew, and Mr. Shaw. So this is the three ethical dilemmas which could arise, right? Let me see. Okay, and finally it comes to uh, recommendation, right? But you can identify more than this also. So now let's see. Whenever you are given an ethical question in the exam, try to identify first what are the ethical issues. What are the ethical, at least 3, 4, 5 points you must be able to get. Once you get the point, write it somewhere, and then based on that you can elaborate on it. So it would be very easy for you to write. So that's why they have talked first about Mrs. Davis, right? Because that is in the starting. They are going in the order of the case. So in the first paragraph they talked about Mrs. Davis only. The wife and the nephew comes later into the picture. So Mr. Shaw is facing a number of ethical dilemmas arising from scenario. What are those? Let's see. Mrs. Dowey's insistence that a restructuring provision should be included could constitute an intimation trade, right? So it's an intimation trade. Mrs. Dowey's insistence that a provision in restructuring provision, right, should be included. Okay, could constitute an intimation threat, although her motivation for including the provision early is unclear. See, it's very unclear. They didn't tell about her motivation. What was her motivation for including the provision early is unclear. Mr. Shaw is also a qualified member of ACCA and therefore should be aware that the treatment is inconsistent with the IAS. Right? You need to mention this words. Whenever ethics question comes, you need to say that he is a qualified member of ACCA. He should be aware, right? The treatment is inconsistent with IAS. This types of words, this type of sentences has to be there in your ethics, right? Qualified member, he should be aware of this IAS and such words, right? So Mr. Shaw must adhere to the ACCA Code of Ethics and prepare financial statements diligently which are objective and fully compliant with IFRS. This is this is kind of recommendation. This is kind of an action which Mr. Shaw needs to do. They are saying here, right? Mr. Shaw. From here to here, it's kind of an action if you see. They are saying, right? He should adhere to the ACC Code of Ethics, prepare financial statements diligently which are objective and fully comply with IFRS. He must not comply with Mrs. Davis' request, right? You need to mention these points. If when you see through your past papers, all the ethics question in fact has this kind of sentences. He should not comply with, he should not listen to this, right? He should politely remind her of the professional duties. So this kind of sentences will be repeated. Although the case is different, but this kind of sentences is there. So, okay. So he must not comply with Mrs. Davis' request and should politely see how they are saying. Okay, you also should, your answer also should be similar like this. You cannot say be rude to her. You must throw tantrums, right? You cannot say that Mr. Shaw should throw tantrums to Mrs. Davis saying, "I will leave the company. I will complain about you if you do like." You cannot. They are saying politely, remind politely, right? Politely remind her of her professional responsibilities as a member of ACC. Non-compliance with accounting standards, right? Non-compliance here with accounting standards should be a breach of a range of ethical principles including professional competence, professional behavior, and objectivity. So these three things. You need to mention about the ACCA's Code of Ethics. What are the ACCA's Code of Ethics? Which principles are going to be breached? You need to talk about out of the 5 principles, right? What are the other 2? Already 3 they have talked. The other 2 is confidentiality and the integrity, right? So you need to mention always which one is breached out of the 5, right? Which ethical principle is breached? if you don't follow, or if you're not complying. Assuming that Mrs. Dove is aware of the error, her integrity would also be questionable, right? So this kind of sentences you can put. You can assume something, right? Clearly they haven't told in the case study, right? That she's aware of the error, she's unaware of the error. But you can write in your sentence, assuming, right? You are assuming that Mrs. Dawes is aware of the error. What happens if she's aware of the error? Her integrity would also be questionable. If she's aware, if she's not aware, that's another case. Mr. Shaw could be accused of insider. Now they're talking about the wife. Mr. Shaw could be accused of insider trading, okay, were he to inform his wife of the proposed restructure, right? Insider trading involves the use of non-publicized information in order to make decisions of financial investment based on information which others do not know about. It is clear that such behavior would not be ethical, since Mr. Shaw would be in an advantageous position to make investment decisions which could impact unfairly on other shareholders, right? So he could get an unfair advantage because he has an insider information. Using that, he could inform his wife and they could make the investment decision, which is not fair. So it's not ethical. So something is ethical or not is based on this, right? Just because we are always an ethic question is given and we are always in a, our mind is always that we should say something is not ethical, something is not. No, there are instances, there are cases where something is ethical and you need to say that no, this appears ethical in this case. It should be both the way, right? Don't always think that something has to be unethical only. But in this case, it is clear that it's not ethical if Mr. Shaw is to inform his wife, right? Some things are very clear cut. It's easy to say it's ethical or not. But in some scenarios, it's very difficult to say whether it's ethical or not. And there you need to use your professional judgment, your own judgment. What do you think? Whether it's ethical or not. All right. So insider traders have information which others do not have, such that other stakeholders may act differently and make different decisions should they be been private to the same information. Such activities are seen as fraudulent and are likely to be in breach of local money laundering regulations. Right. Now the last paragraph. Mr. Shaw has been privy to confidential information regarding Backshot Company. One of the ACCA's key ethical principles is that of confidentiality. Now they are talking about the confidentiality. Information must not be disclosed to others unless there's a legal or professional duty or right or duty to disclose. Okay, that's the definition of confidential they are giving. Professional accountants must also ensure that they do not use confidential information for their own personal benefit. Mr. Shaw has self-interest threat arising from both his wife's ownership of the shares and from his nephew facing potential redundancy. Right? In this case, it's very clear that Mr. Shaw will be facing a self-interest threat. Why? His wife's ownership is there, and nephew is facing a risk of being made redundant, right? So his wife could use the information to consider whether she may wish to sell her 5% ownership interest. Mr. Shaw may also feel pressure to inform his nephew of the potential redundancy he may be facing, right? Whenever you have to come up with such sentences, I know it's a little difficult because you might be thinking how to come up, because it's not theory, also it's not something where you can apply your technical knowledge, memorize or something. This is something which comes from your side, right? So it's very easy. Just imagine yourself as Mr. Shaw falling into that situation, and just imagine that on one side you have your nephew, your friends, or your other relatives, on the other side you have your wife. Yeah, like, so in that condition, what will you do? What will you think of doing, right? Obviously, you will be having that thing that you should tell your wife, and you should be if your friend is there or your nephew is there, whoever it is, if you know that he's going to be sacked off, right? You will be feeling that pressure to tell him. It's very clear. You cannot say no, I'll be very ethical, I will not do this. It's very hard, right? In that situation, it's very hard because it's someone you know, your close ones. So you will be in a pressure to tell. So just imagine what you will do in that condition. right? The condition which a Mr. Face is facing. Just imagine yourself in that, and then you will know how you will know, right? The answers you should write in this case. So that's an exam technique, right? On your exam day, you can use this technique. So Mr. Shaw may also feel pressure to inform his nephew of the potential redundancy he may be facing. This may allow his nephew to obtain an unfair advantage over fellow employees. It's very clear. If he gets the information, he will have an unfair advantage over fellow employees by, for example, how? Examining other opportunities in the labor market. That's why this case, in this part, ethics part, there are professional marks. Two professional marks are there in this part. Because you need to apply your commercial acumen. You need to know, you need to be aware of this, right? What happens when a person is known that he's going to be unemployed? Just think of the practical solutions. You need to write practical reasons, right? He will go and search for other jobs, right? So exactly the same thing they're writing, examining other opportunities in the labor market. So is it very tough? It's very practical. You just need to think practical. What someone do if they come to know that they are being unemployed? They will go and search for alternative jobs. So that's how you are going to write it, right? Interpret it. Mr. Shaw must not disclose. Finally, you are going to write the conclusion. What he should not do or what he should do. Mr. Shaw must not disclose the confidential information to his wife or his nephew. Right? So this is how it should be. And with this, we are over with part 2, right? Where we discuss question 2 of March 2020 paper. So part 3 is going to come up soon. And we'll be discussing question 3 in part 3. So make sure that you watch my video. And thank you for watching.